One of the core principles of circularity is collaboration and diversity, making sure that the actors who are involved and implicated in a system have a voice and a seat at the table. In Germany and Europe, they really need to better understand the context and design models and processes that can adapt and respond to those who are really adding and creating value in the circular economy system.
Hello and welcome to our next episode of TikTok, our Venro podcast about Agenda 2030 and the 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals we committed to achieve. My name is Katharina Linnepe, and as I said, TikTok is the name of our podcast, which means the clock is ticking and we're still far behind from achieving the SDGs. So there's a lot to do and a lot to be done in many areas. One of them is the circular economy. On the one hand, it is essential for the preservation of our planet. On the other hand, our measures here have a direct impact on poorer countries. This is because industrialized countries export waste and used goods to countries in the global south in particular, which has many negative effects. We would like to talk about this whole range of aspects with Joanna Bingham, CEO of Footprints Africa. Hello, Joanna, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, Joanna, can you tell us a bit about the mission of Footprints Africa and your work for the organization?
Thank you so much. So Footprints Africa is a non-profit based in Ghana, West Africa, and we operate across the continent. Our mission is to prove that business can be a force for good, and we run programs in person in Ghana and virtually across the continent to help companies to improve their social and environmental impact. We have a big focus on the informal sector and empowering and including the informal sector. Alongside this, we're very passionate about showing examples and case studies from across the continent of successful, innovative entrepreneurs. We've seen and been inspired by so many entrepreneurs across the continent who are really interrogating our capitalist business models and showcasing that you can both have a business that has profit, but you can also create value for your communities as well and do no harm. So we have created a database of over 500 case studies of such entrepreneurs across Africa operating in the circular economy. And we've started to measure their impact to support them to be able to tell the story so that they're not going to be compared with greenwashing companies who have a nice marketing strategy that shows they're doing a little bit of recycling, but aren't really changing things at a fundamental level. So we've been helping entrepreneurs to measure and show the value that they're creating.
Great. Yeah, sounds very interesting. Thanks for sharing these insights. Now let's talk a bit about exports and the effects of exports, especially waste and used goods exports. They seem to have many negative effects on African countries, but there are also, anti-economic sectors benefiting from them. So can you tell us more about these pros and cons and maybe also share your opinion what an ideal way of coping with this would be, in your opinion?
I think we need to be quite clear separating waste and used goods. And we should absolutely be encouraging trade globally of used goods and particularly locally. This can have valuable impact in terms of reuse. So I think one of the challenges we're facing with circular economy right now is everyone is focused on end of life and talking about recycling because it's the easiest and most visible consequence of our linear economy. So talking about waste, but actually we really need to be talking about reuse, refurbish, and remanufacture of products and keeping those products in life for as long as possible. So where that can happen, and where that can create value for African economies, that's a highly valuable trade. However, what's really happening is not quite that. So that does happen. But for example, if you take the fashion and textile sector and specifically look at Ghana, for example, that's a very active trade. And one of the largest secondhand markets is in Ghana for clothing, and a lot of Europe and American clothing come to Ghana to be resold. However, about 50% of that is waste. It's trash, it's crappy clothing, it's stained, it's ripped, it's things that people have taken to the charity shop that they know in good conscience isn't decent quality. And that gets sold. It's not donated to African countries, it gets sold to them. And so therefore, that's creating huge losses for businesses and business owners who are buying that material to then resell, buying those items of clothing to resell. And it ends up in landfill. So they're actually importing waste, which is creating huge challenges on already overburdened infrastructure. So There are pros in terms of trade and in terms of being able to access quality items if items are quality at lower prices when they're secondhand, for example. And there's value in keeping materials and components in use. That's fantastic. However, it's not being properly administered. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is the other side of the trade. So, for example, goods are being exported from Europe and imported into Africa. But at the same time, many African countries are exporting their raw materials, which are being imported into Europe. And so I think there also has to be some thought at the beginning of the chain as well when talking about pros and cons and where these global trade systems are creating value and where they're exploiting and extracting value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. So let's have a deeper look on circular economy and the situation in Africa. Can you give us some insights here or even share some examples from particular countries about, the circular economy and, in the situation?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, we have developed a database of over 500 case studies of circular economy initiatives. So we've started to get a picture of what circularity actually looks like on the ground. One of the things that we can see, and I think is no secret from anyone, is that in Africa, people are incredibly resourceful. There is much less waste. Things are not, when the newest version comes out, people aren't necessarily clamoring to get it. They're making sure that what they have works and lasts for as long as possible. And that's an ethos that is very embedded and potentially is being lost as we create these more aspirational ideals of the newest iPhone and the marketing techniques that require people to have new. The other thing that we've seen with circular entrepreneurs is that they're problem solving. So they are identifying problems that they're seeing in their communities and they're finding commercial avenues to solve these problems. So that might be using waste as a resource, which is one of the strongest principles that's being employed in Africa. And some people would look at that and say, oh, this is low value circular economy because it's using waste as a resource. But actually, one of the reasons for that is because many of the design decisions that are made on products that are found in Africa are not made in Africa. So they're not necessarily made for the context in which they're finding themselves in. And so you're seeing entrepreneurs solving these challenges by finding new ways of addressing waste, of repairing, and of cycling nutrients. There's so many entrepreneurs and so many examples I could point to, but I want to talk about one incredibly innovative entrepreneur from Kenya who runs a business called Mycotile. And what they do is they grow mycelium on agricultural waste to create building materials. So this is a fascinating example where biological nutrients are being used in construction, which is how things were done in the past. And it's the chemical properties of these materials are such that it contains a chemical compound, I believe it's called a chemical called chitin, which I believe is fire retardant. So it's naturally fire retardant. It naturally has the properties that are required for building materials. It's using agricultural waste and it's avoiding the use of things like concrete and some of the more harmful materials that you might find. And he's creating roofing panels, for example, with these materials. So I just think it's a wonderful example of someone who is taking the resources they see around them in terms of waste and finding new use for them. That is addressing another challenge in terms of some of the massive housing crises we're seeing, particularly around affordable housing on the continent. So I love that as a business model.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for this great example. So from your perspective, from your experience, what do you think, how can we here in Germany, in the EU, support circular economy and support the adaptation to circular economy in the global south? What do you think, how should this support ideally look like?
So one of the key principles of circular economy is to design out waste and to design closed loops into the system. So that for me is the number one. When you're looking at product design, when you're looking at process design, wherever you're exporting those products to, it has to be appropriate to the context. So it has to be processable. Any waste has to be usable. Any materials, any repair has to be appropriate for the context in which it's finding itself in. So for me, number one is design. And some examples of that right now, I know there's a big movement to look at EPR, so extended producer responsibility, where the producers of materials have to take responsibility for the end of life of those materials or products. And so there's a lot of study going into that. There's already well-established systems in Europe. One of the challenges is for products that find themselves in many African contexts, it's usually the informal sector who's taking responsibility, who is collecting, repairing, processing many of these products when they find themselves in African context. And how do you get funding? How do you make sure that the funding, that extended producer responsibility fees, are finding themselves to those in the informal sector who don't necessarily have the same organizational and governance structures? How are you making sure that they are adequately compensated? Because oftentimes the way they might be processing lacks some of the health and safety standards that we require. So it poses challenges to human health and environmental health. But at the same time, these informal workers are doing an incredible job of making sure that these products are kept in use, that any valuable materials are being extracted and reused. So I think there are some areas where in Germany and Europe, they really need to better understand the context and design models and processes that can adapt and respond to those who are really adding and creating value in the circular economy system.
There is currently a lot going on here in Germany in developing a national circular economy strategy, and in the EU in developing a European action plan. From your point of view, what impact can the transformation to a circular economy in Germany, in the EU, have on countries in the global south? What impact do you see in this transformation process?
It depends entirely how it's done. So if this is done in how can Germany be more circular, focusing only on Germany, then I think it can have a negative and harmful impact on lower income countries. One of the things that I think needs to happen is an assessment of power balance and where power structures sit and power dynamics, because we have to look at the context that we're in and the historic situation that has led to the fact that raw materials are extracted from Africa and processed and are enriching Europe. And until we address some of those power imbalances and some of those historic issues, I don't think we're going to have any particular change. And we will lose the opportunity to create more equitable society that circular economy can pose.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So you've already given us great examples in different fields. What do you think? Are there some examples for a successful transformation process, as we are talking about this sort of transformation process? You can tell us about successful transformation processes in Africa or promising starting points that you can share with us or tell us about.
So one of the core principles of circularity is collaboration and diversity, and making sure that the actors who are involved and implicated in a system have a voice and a seat at the table. So for me, any successful transformation process has to ensure that that is part of it. That's hard. And it's slow and it takes a long time. It means bringing together people who don't necessarily speak the same language, both literally and in terms of, some people are very commercial and they talk only about commercial business jargon, and some people just can't relate and engage with that kind of language. So it's a process, and there's a process of trust building that goes into that. There's a few areas where I've seen that starting to happen, but it's too early to say whether it's successful. So in Ghana right now, the World Economic Forum has set up the National Plastics Action Partnership, and it's a multi-stakeholder, very dialogue and inclusive focused process. They have an inclusion task force, which I'm part of. And the idea is to really look at the role of the informal sector, marginalized, gender challenges, intersectionality, and really make sure that any policy, any financial instruments are designed to be inclusive. Like I said, it's a slow process. Bringing everyone around the table is a slow process. There's lots of historic distrust there. We have, as part of that process, been speaking to South Africa. There's an amazing process that occurred in South Africa to look at how informal waste pickers could be included in the EPR scheme. That hasn't been perfect, but there's a huge amount we can learn from the time and effort they took to be inclusive during that process. And for me, those are really key aspects.
Yeah, right. So speaking of a process, speaking of the transformation process, speaking of it globally, what can nations like Germany, what can the European Union learn from transformation processes towards circular economy in Africa? What can we learn and perhaps adapt in our strategies as well?
I think consultation with those who are most impacted. So if we know that climate change is going to adversely affect the most vulnerable the most, to what extent are they given a seat at the table in policy making? And consultation, I've seen consultation done well, I've seen it done badly. Consultation done badly is where you go and tell someone about something or you ask their opinion, but you don't necessarily have to include it. What I'm talking about is consultation done well, where people are genuinely part of a process and they have genuine decision-making power in that process. I've seen some interesting examples where people are putting a representative of Mother Nature on the boards of their companies. And I think something like that should happen in, for example, German political processes, where you have someone who's representing, who's genuinely representative and who's representing the voices of those who are going to be most implicated. So that's what I would really like to see.
Joanna, thank you very much for joining us today and for the great interview. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.